51 years after the events, the tragedy and miracle of the Andes continue to surprise the world in many ways. After several adaptations, among which Alive, the 1993 American film, stands out, the Spanish director J.A. Bayona dares to show us his own vision of this story of survival under the production of Netflix, based on the book of the same name, written by Uruguayan journalist Pablo Vietti. The Society of the Snow is a chillingly vivid experience. Talking about this film is almost like talking about the actual incident, given the level of detail and realism that Bayona imprinted. But what stands out most is the heart behind the story, the deep love that develops between the characters who are willing to give their lives for the survival of their friends. In case you don't know this story, I'll quickly recap it. On October 13, 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force plane left Montevideo for Santiago de Chile. On board were 40 passengers and 5 crew members. Most of them were young players and members of the rugby team of the Old Christians Club, as well as friends and relatives. To reach Santiago de Chile, the plane had to pass through the inhospitable Andes Mountains. But after a miscalculation by the pilots, the plane ended up crashing into the mountains, splitting in half and killing 16 passengers. The 29 survivors endured for 72 days. A nightmare that consisted of living in the most extreme conditions imaginable, from extreme temperatures to having to resort to anthropophagy, consuming human flesh, in order to survive. A nightmare that could only end when the survivors Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa walked for 10 days through a large part of the mountain region in search of help. Of the 29 who survived the crash, only 16 were able to return home. Although Bayona's film is not just about the survivors, not for nothing is it called Snow Society. From this point on, we'll be talking with spoilers about Netflix's shocking adaptation, so run right now to see it. After his experience in the impossible and Jurassic World, Fallen Kingdom, J.A. Bayona had already established himself in Hollywood. But instead of going the blockbuster route, the Spanish director decided to tell something much more personal, emotional, and deeply human. The Society of the Snow hits you from the very first moment with a glimpse of the Andes Mountains, which can be considered a character. The survivors' small plane can barely be seen from a distance. They are nothing more than ants in the face of the wildest nature. As hopeless as it sounds, the film is rooted in precisely that emotion: hope, the desire to return home, and the cooperation necessary to make it happen. From the first scenes, you feel like a friend of the characters, and while everyone is the protagonist, the narrator is Numa Toccati, played by the young Enzo Vogrincic. Like Numa, we viewers had little to do with most of the passengers. We didn't even know them, but their charisma and youthful purity made us get on the plane with them. Unparalleled fun awaited them at their destination, although fate had other plans for them. It was a bold decision to give the role of narrator to Numa, for as we all know, he died in the mountains. Before that, he was just a young law student who accepted the invitation of his friend Pancho Delgado, one of the rugby team players. It could be said that he was the unluckiest passenger since he shared no family ties with any of them, but he ended up becoming a pillar for everyone's survival. As a quiet leader, Numa fought to the end until an infected wound in his leg became too complicated, taking his life. At the moment of his death, Numa gave a note to the others which said, "There is no greater love than to give your life for your friends." That simple but beautiful phrase can be summed up in this cinematic work, which portrays the experience of both the living and the dead. Speaking of the dead, Bayona had a complicated challenge to show the acts of anthropophagy committed by the survivors. For obvious reasons, he couldn't be too graphic, though he didn't opt for the easy option of letting the viewer understand. Both in the film and in the true story, the consumption of human flesh was not only for survival purposes, but was an expression of love for those who could not return home. At first glance, it is disturbing, but taking into account Numa's phrase, that was an act of love for the others, so that they would continue to breathe for those who stopped. For a part of them to return to their families and loved ones. None of them stayed in the mountains, nor can we forget the technical aspect of the film, which is an absolute marvel in every way. Pedro Luque's cinematography is as beautiful as it is gripping. It portrays the harshness of the extreme conditions of the Andes without neglecting its natural beauty. It is almost contradictory that there can be so much suffering in such a mystical place, but that is exactly what happened in real life. In addition, the film achieves a perfect balance in the composition of close and terrifying shots, which convey darkness and claustrophobia. Also noteworthy is the moment of the crash, narrated through the perspective of an eye and followed by a moment of silence, transcending the mere representation of the disaster itself. Unlike other disaster films that flood their most chaotic scenes with dramatic music and fast-paced shots, Bayona places the viewer directly in the plane. We watched as bodies squeezed together and flew out. We listened as passengers screamed as their bones broke. It is undoubtedly the crudest sequence of the film, but still does not fall into morbidity or gore. And that's because the narrative is based on respect for those involved in the accident. To understand what they had to do to protect the greatest possession we all have, our lives. The feeling of hope imbued in its script is enhanced by the music of the incredible Michael Giacchino, characterized by his almost angelic orchestral melodies. It is an embrace for both the survivors and the viewer, even for the victims. Perhaps the voices of the orchestra represent the deceased, giving strength to their friends to carry on. I especially want to highlight the final theme, Found. A return to the ordinary society we are accustomed to has never sounded so beautiful. Sometimes we get lost in our most ambitious desires, and while dreaming of something better isn't bad, we don't value what we already have. Found represents the immense happiness felt by the heroes of the Andes when they return to their homes and families, carrying with them the memory of the deceased. This message of unity would not have been possible without a talented cast that could make their bond believable on screen. Well, not only did they manage to look like friends, they became friends during filming. Bayona ensured that they went through some of the afflictions of the real survivors, only in a controlled way. Thanks to that, the group cohesion became more palpable, and the fact that most of them are brand new actors helps quite a bit to believe that you're watching something real. At the same time, the director also breaks down some stereotypes of masculinity, which were much stricter in the 1970s. When conditions became extreme, these men didn't hesitate to hug for warmth each other, hold hands to comfort each other, and cry on each other's shoulders. Love always makes its way, and we don't have to wait for a plane crash to start showing it to each other. More than a film, The Society of the Snow is a tribute to the protagonists of this incredible true story. It is a conversation between the living and the dead that feels like closure for the heroes who are still among us. That is why this review does not feel like a simple opinion, but a message of admiration to these heroes who never stopped loving each other. They never lost their dignity despite the icy nightmare and found ways to convey their love across the barriers of death. The Society of the Snow is not an easy film to watch. Your tears will fight their way out as you watch it, both out of happiness and sadness, but it is a necessary story for today's disconnected and detached society. It is a reminder that when there is unity, nothing is impossible. We must never forget what these men did in the mountains, because we would be ignoring the most beautiful value of all, love. I want to hear your thoughts on this movie. Leave me a comment down below and I will see you in the next video.